The massive council chamber stretched out like a metal cathedral, filled with beings from across the galaxy. Ambassador Rebecca Walsh stood at the speaking platform, her hands shaking slightly as she held the datapad containing casualty reports from Frontier Station 7. The attack had been brutal, families torn apart, children lost, entire communities destroyed in minutes. As Rebecca began reading the numbers aloud, her voice cracked. She tried to stay professional, but thinking about the 5-year-old girl who died clutching her teddy bear made tears spill down her cheeks. She wiped them away quickly, but it was too late. The damage was done. A deep, rumbling laugh echoed from the Skarn section. Veltar, their lead delegate, stood up on his powerful legs. His scales shifted from green to a mocking yellow color. The Skarn were lizard-like creatures, 8 feet tall, with razor-sharp teeth and claws that could slice through steel. They prided themselves on never showing weakness. "Look at this pathetic display," Veltar announced, his voice booming through the chamber. The human leaks water from her face when discussing simple battlefield statistics. "Your species is fundamentally broken." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the alien delegates. The insectoid collective's representative, a creature that looked like a giant mantis with glowing eyes, clicked its mandibles in what passed for laughter among their kind. "Our computational analysis is complete," the collective drone buzzed through its translator. "Human tier production occurs during stress events. This represents system failure in biological hardware. Humans are too unstable for important positions." Rebecca felt her face burn with embarrassment. She had trained for years to represent humanity in these halls. She spoke 17 alien languages, held 3 advanced degrees in interstellar diplomacy, and had successfully negotiated 12 trade agreements. But none of that mattered now. All they saw were her tears. General Michael Brooks sat in the human observation area, his jaw clenched tight. He had fought in 6 different wars, led troops through impossible battles, and earned respect on a dozen worlds. But here, in this chamber, he was just another emotional human who couldn't be trusted with real responsibility. The Galactic Council had 3 main ruling species. The Skarn controlled most of the military operations. They believed emotions were poison that clouded judgment. Their warriors went through brutal training to remove all feelings except anger, which they channeled into combat effectiveness. The collective handled technology and logistics. They were a hive mind that shared thoughts across millions of drones. Individual emotions didn't exist in their society. They saw human feelings as glitches in programming that needed fixing. The third species, the ethereals, managed diplomacy and trade. They were tall, graceful beings who communicated through telepathy. They considered human emotions to be primitive noise that interfered with clear communication. All 3 species had one thing in common. They saw human tears as proof that humans were weak. Veltar gestured toward Rebecca with one clawed hand. "We cannot trust galactic security to beings who malfunction under pressure. Humans will continue in support roles only. Supply management, data entry, basic maintenance. Nothing that requires emotional control." The vote was swift and unanimous among the alien delegates. Once again, humanity was pushed to the sidelines. Rebecca gathered her papers with shaking hands, trying not to let more tears fall. She had failed her entire species. As the session ended, General Brooks approached Rebecca in the corridor outside. Other humans patted her shoulder supportively, but she felt crushed by the weight of representing 4 billion people and failing them all. "They don't understand us," Brooks said quietly. "They think tears mean we're broken. But crying doesn't make us weak, it makes us human." Rebecca nodded, but inside, she wondered if maybe the aliens were right. Maybe humans really were too emotional for the big decisions that affected entire star systems. The alarm started as a soft beep in the deep space monitoring station orbiting the edge of known space. Dr. Jennifer Adams was reviewing routine sensor data when something impossible appeared on her screens. Ships, massive, geometric shapes emerging from the empty darkness between galaxies where nothing should exist. Jennifer's coffee cup slipped from her hands as she stared at the readings. These weren't just big ships, they were the size of small moons. Perfect triangles and cubes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The energy signatures made her blood run cold because she recognized them from the ancient archives. "Oh no," she whispered, pulling up historical records that most people thought were just scary stories. "Please don't be what I think you are." The data matched perfectly. These were devourers, machine intelligences so old that they existed before most current civilizations even evolved. The last time they appeared, 3 million years ago, they had wiped out entire sections of the galaxy. Billions of worlds stripped bare of all life, turned into raw materials for their endless construction projects. Jennifer immediately sent emergency reports to every government and military command in known space. The response from human leadership was swift. Within hours, emergency meetings were called, and defensive preparations began. But when the reports reached the alien powers, the reaction was very different. Captain David Miller stood in the pristine halls of Skarn High Command, holding detailed tactical assessments and threat projections. He had spent 3 days preparing this presentation, analyzing every piece of data about the approaching fleet. The math was terrifying. If these really were devourers, the galaxy had maybe 6 months before they reached populated systems. "Honored War Leader Caxthul," David began formally. "Our analysis shows these ships possess technology far beyond anything we've encountered. Their approach vector suggests they're targeting the outer colonies first, then moving toward core worlds. We need to begin evacuation procedures immediately." War Leader Caxthul, a massive Skarn with battle scars covering his scales, didn't even look at David's data. "Human fears create phantoms where none exist," he growled dismissively. "Your species has a history of panic over minor threats. These ships are probably just refugees from another galaxy." David felt his heart sink. "Sir, with respect, the energy readings match historical records written by emotional beings who saw monsters in every shadow." Caxthul interrupted. "The Skarn have defended this galaxy for 10,000 years. We know real threats from imagined ones." The other Skarn officers clicked their claws in agreement. They had never lost a major battle and couldn't imagine facing an enemy they couldn't intimidate or outfight. David left the meeting knowing his warnings had fallen on deaf ears. The collective's response was equally frustrating. When human scientists presented their findings to the hive mind's representatives, the insectoid drones processed the data through their shared consciousness and concluded that humans were simply malfunctioning again. Emotional instability creates false pattern recognition, they buzzed through their translators. Human fear responses generate threat scenarios that do not exist. But something interesting was happening among the alien species, even as they dismissed human concerns. The supposedly emotionless beings were starting to show subtle signs of stress. Skarn scales, which normally stayed steady, green or brown, began flickering with yellow warning patterns when they thought no one was looking. Their movements became slightly more aggressive, more territorial. The collective drones, usually flying in perfect geometric formations, started showing tiny irregularities in their flight paths. Individual drones would lag behind by milliseconds, or drift slightly off course before correcting themselves, for a hive mind that prided itself on absolute precision. These were significant anomalies. Even the telepathic ethereals seemed affected. Their usual graceful movements became slightly more hurried, and their mental communications carried undertones of unease that they tried to hide. Meanwhile, humans across the galaxy were openly weeping as they read casualty projections and evacuation plans. But while tears streamed down their faces, they kept working. They stockpiled supplies, reinforced defenses, and created backup communication networks. They cried for the billions who might die, but they never stopped preparing for the worst. The first attack came without warning or declaration of war. Titan's Gate, a fortress world with defensive shields that could stop entire fleets, simply stopped transmitting. One moment the planet was there, bustling with 20 million inhabitants. The next moment, silence. Admiral Robert Kane stood in the command center of the human monitoring station, watching the long-range sensors with growing horror. The massive devourer ships had surrounded Titan's Gate like metallic vultures. Strange beams of light poured down from orbit, but these weren't weapons in any traditional sense. They were harvesting tools. "My God," Robert whispered, tears already forming in his eyes as he watched the impossible happen. The planetary surface was being peeled away layer by layer. Mountains dissolved into streams of raw materials that flowed upward into the waiting ships. Cities, forests, oceans, everything was being converted into basic elements and absorbed. The worst part was how methodical it all looked. There was no rage, no conquest, no victory celebrations, just efficient processing of resources. Within 18 hours, Titan's Gate was gone, not destroyed, but completely consumed. Where a living world once existed, only empty space remained. New Arcturus fell next. This time, the Skarn were ready. War leader Caxtool himself led a battle fleet of 300 ships to defend the colony world. Robert watched through the tactical displays as the proud Skarn warriors approached the geometric devourer vessels. The Skarn followed their ancient battle traditions. They broadcast challenge calls across all frequencies, demanding single combat with the enemy leaders. They performed ritual displays of strength, firing weapons in ceremonial patterns to show their power. Caxtool's flagship even rammed one of the smaller devourer ships to demonstrate Skarn courage. The machines didn't respond at all. Not to the challenges, not to the displays, not even to the ramming attack. They simply continued their harvesting, while methodically destroying any ship that came too close. There was no emotion, no acknowledgement that a battle was even happening. The Skarn fleet was dismantled piece by piece with the same clinical efficiency used to strip the planet below. Robert watched Caxtool's final transmission, the proud war leader's scales flashing desperate colors as he realized his entire worldview was crumbling. "Why won't you fight us properly?" Caxtool roared into his communicator. "We are Skarn. We are warriors. Face us with honor." The only response was a harvesting beam that dissolved his flagship in seconds. The Skarn evacuation ships tried to flee, but the devourers picked them off one by one, not out of cruelty or anger, but because they contained useful organic materials. Haven's rest lasted the longest, all of 36 hours. The collective had stationed a massive drone swarm there, millions of interconnected units that could coordinate perfect defensive patterns. Robert held out hope that maybe their hive mind could find a solution that individual thinking couldn't, but the devourers adapted instantly to every tactic the drones used. When the collective formed defensive walls, the machines simply went around them. When they tried hit-and-run attacks, the harvesters predicted their movements perfectly. The hive mind's greatest strength, their ability to think as one, meant nothing to enemies that operated on pure logic. Dr. Jennifer Adams joined Robert in the command center as they watched the final hours of Haven's rest. Tears streamed down both their faces as they witnessed entire cities being processed into raw materials. Children's playgrounds, hospitals, schools, all reduced to basic elements and sucked up into the waiting ships. "I don't understand," Robert said, his voice breaking. "Why are they doing this? What do they want?" Jennifer pulled up her analysis reports, her hands shaking as she pointed to the data. "That's just it, Robert. They don't want anything. They're not conquering us or trying to send a message. Look at the collection patterns. They're harvesting carbon, silicon metals, water. They're strip mining entire worlds because we're made of useful materials. The horrible truth hit Robert like a physical blow. They don't see us as enemies. No, Jennifer whispered. We're not enemies or allies or threats. We're just resources. To be collected, like oil or coal or iron or... They're not angry at us any more than we get angry at a forest when we cut it down for lumber. The news of the 3 fortress worlds spread across the galaxy like a disease. Panic set in as species that had never known true fear suddenly faced their own mortality. But the worst part wasn't the fear itself, it was watching the supposedly superior alien races completely fall apart under pressure. The collective was the first to crack. For millions of years, their hive mind had operated on the principle that every death had meaning, every sacrifice served the greater good. Individual drones died in battle, but their memories and experiences were instantly shared with the whole network. Death was just data transfer, but the Devourers changed everything. When the machines processed entire worlds, they weren't just killing collective drones. They were erasing them completely. No final thoughts to share, no last wisdom to pass on, no noble sacrifice for the hive. Just sudden, meaningless termination. The hive mind couldn't handle it. Across dozens of worlds, collective drones began acting erratically. Some flew in endless circles, their programming stuck in loops as they tried to process the concept of pointless death. Others simply stopped moving, their consciousness retreating from reality. The network that had once been perfectly coordinated started fragmenting into thousands of isolated groups, each one consumed by existential terror. The Skarn warriors, who had built their entire culture around intimidation and dominance, faced an even worse breakdown. For 10,000 years, their battle tactics had been based on one simple truth: show your enemy that you're stronger and more vicious than they are, and they'll either submit or die trying to prove otherwise. But the Devourers didn't care about strength or intimidation. When Skarn warbands performed their ritual displays of aggression, the machines didn't even acknowledge them. When they roared their battle cries and showed their claws, the harvesters just continued their work. The psychological foundation of Skarn society crumbled overnight. Lieutenant Colonel Jessica Parker watched it all happen from the command bunker on Kepler Prime, a major colony world with 8 million inhabitants. As the Devourers approached the system, refugees from a dozen different species flooded in, hoping the planet's defensive systems could protect them. Jessica had been put in charge of evacuation operations, a support role that the aliens thought was appropriate for an emotional human. But as the crisis deepened, she found herself coordinating the defense of the entire system because the alien commanders had stopped functioning. The Skarn general assigned to Kepler Prime spent his days staring at tactical displays, his scales shifting between colors of confusion and despair. He couldn't understand how to fight an enemy that didn't respond to his threats. The collective coordinator had gone completely silent, its consciousness withdrawn into some internal loop of terror. Jessica worked 18-hour days organizing transport ships, setting up refugee camps, and coordinating with the few remaining functional military units. Tears streamed down her face constantly as she read casualty reports and made impossible decisions about who to evacuate first. But she never stopped working. Her soldiers noticed it too. Sergeant Thomas Wright approached her during a brief break between crisis meetings. He was young, barely 25, and had been crying on and off for days as they processed refugee families. "Colonel Parker," Thomas said, his voice shaky but determined, "I've been watching the aliens. The Skarn guards won't leave their barracks anymore. The collective drones just hover in corners, doing nothing. But we're still here, still fighting. Why are we the only ones still functioning?" Jessica wiped fresh tears from her eyes and looked at her tactical display showing the approaching Devourer fleet. Around the command center, her staff, all of them openly crying, continued coordinating defensive positions and evacuation schedules. They were heartbroken, terrified, and exhausted, but they kept going. You know what, Thomas? Jessica said, managing a small smile through her tears. I think it's because we've always known how to hurt and keep going. The Skarn never learned to deal with helplessness because they were always the strongest. The collective never faced meaningless death because they always found purpose in everything. She gestured toward her weeping staff members who were still doing their jobs despite everything. But humans, we've been dealing with random tragedy our whole history. We've buried children, lost wars, faced disasters that made no sense. We learned a long time ago that sometimes terrible things happen for no reason at all. Thomas nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. And we cry about it. Exactly, Jessica said. We cry about it. We grieve. We hurt like hell. But then we get back to work anyway. That's not weakness, Thomas. That's the strongest thing any species can do. The massive Devourer fleet hung in space above Centauri Prime, the beating heart of galactic civilization. Hundreds of geometric ships blotted out the stars, their harvesting beams already beginning to strip away the outer atmosphere. This was it, the final battle for everything that lived and breathed in the galaxy. General Michael Brooks stood on the bridge of the human flagship, promoted to Supreme Commander not through politics or tradition, but because he was the only senior officer still mentally functional. Around him, representatives from every surviving species watched their home worlds die on the tactical displays, and for the first time in galactic history, they were all crying. The proud Skarn delegates sobbed openly, their scales shifting through colors of grief they had never experienced before. Collective drones leaked strange fluids from their compound eyes as their hive minds struggled with emotions they had no words for. Even the telepathic ethereals wept tears of pure psychic energy that sparkled in the air like falling stars. These species had spent millennia mocking humans for their tears, calling them weak and unstable. But now, faced with the complete extinction of their civilizations, they finally understood what grief felt like, and unlike humans, they had no idea how to function while feeling it. Ambassador Rebecca Walsh, now heading the Emergency War Council, watched the alien breakdown with a mixture of sadness and irony. She had spent years being dismissed and ridiculed for showing emotion during diplomatic meetings. Now these same beings were paralyzed by feelings they couldn't control or understand. But Rebecca had been working on something during the long retreat to Centauri Prime. She had studied every encounter with the Devourers, analyzing their behavior patterns and tactical responses. These machines were incredibly advanced, but they had one fatal flaw. They were perfectly predictable. General Brooks, Rebecca said, approaching him with a datapad full of calculations. I think I know how to hurt them. Brooks wiped tears from his eyes and looked at her analysis. Tell me, they're efficient, right? They always take the path that uses the least energy and resources. They process planets in specific patterns, always starting with population centers, because that's where the most organic matter is concentrated. Rebecca's voice was steady, despite the tears on her cheeks. But what if we made them choose between efficiency and completion? Brooks studied her tactical plan, and for the first time in weeks, he smiled. You want to use their predictability against them? Exactly. We can't outfight them, but we might be able to outthink them. The plan was brilliant in its simplicity. The remaining human fleet would scatter across the system, each ship broadcasting fake life signs from different directions. The Devourers would have to choose between chasing down individual ships or continuing their systematic harvesting of the planet. Their programming would force them to make the most efficient choice. But first, Rebecca had to address the combined fleet. She looked out at the view screen, showing thousands of ships from every species in the galaxy. Skarn battlecruisers, collective swarm vessels, ethereal peacekeepers, and human warships, all flying together for the first time in history. This is Ambassador Walsh to all fleet units, she broadcast, her voice carrying across space to every surviving ship. I want to say something to our alien allies who are listening. For generations, You called our tears a sign of weakness. You said humans were too emotional for important decisions, too unstable for real responsibility. She paused, looking at General Brooks and the human crew around her. All of them had tears in their eyes, but all of them were still working, still fighting, still hoping. But here we are at the end of everything, and we're still standing. We're still making plans, still coordinating attacks, still protecting each other. Yes, we're crying. We're heartbroken that billions have died. We're terrified that we might fail. We're grieving for worlds that will never see another sunrise. Her voice grew stronger, carrying the weight of humanity's long struggle for acceptance. But tears don't make us fragile, they make us human. And humans don't break. We bend, we cry, we bleed, we hurt in ways that cut us to our very souls, ... And then we get back up. Through the communication channels, she could hear alien voices. Some sobbing, some cheering, all of them finally understanding what they had dismissed for so long. The galaxy is learning something today, Rebecca continued. True courage isn't the absence of fear or pain or tears. True courage is feeling all of that and still choosing to fight for something bigger than yourself. So let's show these machines what emotional beings can do when we stand together. The final battle began with tears streaming down every face in the fleet. But those tears weren't signs of defeat. They were proof of something the Devourers could never understand. The power to feel loss and keep fighting anyway.